Hello, it's Laura Anderson with the Voice of Laura Anderson podcast. This week, it's Andrew Ridgeley, Wham, and me. As a teenager, I loved Wham, especially Andrew Ridgeley. He was the guy for me. When they broke up, I was crushed, and then George Michael came out with the Faith album, and I was blown away. But I always wondered about Andrew. When I clipped photos of them, I had more of Andrew than of George, and they made up a collage of pictures on the wall behind my bed as well as on the inside of my locker at school. So it's no surprise that earlier this year, I became quite giddy when I found out that Andrew Ridgeley was coming out with a memoir in October. It was released on October 8th, called Wham, George Michael, and Me. I actually tried to get an interview with Andrew Ridgeley, but he's so booked with interviews already that I wasn't able to talk with him. I mean, I'm not in love with him anymore, but it still would have been really cool. However, the publisher did send me a copy of his book. I mean, I would have bought it anyway, but it's nice to get a free copy. I read it in record time, for me anyway. One thing I love about the book is the amount of pictures in it. And it's not just a few sections of glossy picture pages like you would expect in an autobiography, but also littered throughout the book. Well, litter's not a good word because it's a good thing and litter's usually a bad thing. But throughout the book, you'll see black and white photos of George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley that fit whatever Andrew is writing about. Overall, I loved the book. Wham, for me as a teenager, got me through some really tough times. The music just helped me feel better about life, and so did the pictures. The book is a lot of fun, and it gives you a really good insight into how they got together, as well as how the music came to be, why they didn't stay together as Wham for a long time. And it's just a good look at the few years that Andrew Ridgeley and George Michael were Wham. The one thing I would have wanted more in the book, since it is an autobiography, is more about Andrew Ridgeley's life since Wham. He wrote a little bit about getting into auto racing, just briefly, and also about the album he recorded as a solo artist called Son of Albert. But that really was it. He didn't get into depth about what his personal life was like, other things he's done. I know he does some charity bike riding now, and I wish he would have gotten into more of that. But I guess for him, the focus on the book was telling us about the Wham years. If you go to Wikipedia or a lot of other websites, the basic story of Wham will say that George Michael, which is his stage name, he actually has a long Greek name that I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce. He came to the school that Andrew Ridgeley was at in a place called Bushey in England, and the teacher put Andrew Ridgeley in charge of helping him to acclimate to the school. And then you may read that Andrew Ridgeley told George they were forming a band, and they started off with the executive, then they did Wham. What this book tells you is more detail about that first day that they met and how they bonded, what they bonded over, what they didn't talk about with each other at all. It turns out that music is what George and Andrew primarily bonded over. They would hang out in their bedrooms, listening to their favorite artists on records, coming up with dance routines, which I would love to have seen at that time, when they were just 16, coming up with their own dance routines at home in their bedroom. And so many of us have done that. One of the things Andrew mentioned in the book is how much they loved the top 40 countdown on Sunday afternoon. It was probably different than the one that we had here with Casey Kasem, but boy, I loved that. And I was so excited at the end of 1984 when Careless Whisper came out as number 1. But back in the 70s, when they were listening to the top 40, it turns out that George, who Andrew called Yog, was able to record it. He told Andrew that he always recorded the top 40 on Sunday afternoon, and he kept the songs that he liked. Sadly, Andrew only had a single cassette player, and it didn't record from the radio. I did a lot of recording of songs from the radio, too, and of course that included making mixtapes with them. Andrew didn't say anything about mixtapes in the book, but I'll bet there was at least 1 or 2 Wham songs on a mixtape I made for a guy that I really liked one time. Yeah, there probably was. It could have been I'm Your Man. I love that song. That, I think, is my favorite Wham song, I'm Your Man. Sadly, Andrew didn't write about it in the book, which really bummed me out. I would love to have heard more about it. That video where they recorded it at the Marquee and it was in black and white, that's my favorite Wham video. I couldn't wait for it to play again and again on MTV, back when MTV really was music TV. There was one time I remember hearing that Wham would be in the studio, or I think they said in the studio, on a Sunday night on WPST in Trenton, New Jersey. I could barely get in the radio station But I sat there and listened as hard as I could through all that noise of bad reception, and I recorded it. It wasn't the best recording, but still I felt like I was so close to Wham because the radio station really wasn't that far away from me. I grew up in New Jersey, and it's not a huge state. Having worked in radio since then, though, I wonder, did Wham really show up in the studio for WPST, or was it a syndicated show that was sent down through a satellite or sent overseas on a reel-to-reel? I think it was live, but I've wondered about that over the years ever since. I don't think I still have that tape. But in the book, Andrew does talk about when they came to the U.S. for some marketing, so I'm keeping that hope alive that they were really so close. Not that it really makes a difference all these years later. It's just the imagination. I mentioned that in the book, Andrew Ridgeley didn't write much about, or anything at all, about the song I'm Your Wham. I'm Your Wham. The song I'm Your Man. Yes, they were our Wham. But the song I'm Your Man. He did say, however, that he loved performing the song Edge of Heaven. He said that was his favorite one to perform when they went through on their final concert round because he said there was just a lot of energy to it. With that album, the Edge of Heaven album, one of the songs that I also really liked was Battle Stations, because in the 80s, having a voicemail machine was a big deal. And that song starts off as somebody calling another person, George Michael calling a woman, and him getting her voicemail. And then the song is the message that he leaves on her voicemail. And I love that imagery and the idea of doing that. I don't know of any other songs that did that at the time. There may have been, but that's just the one that I know. So I always thought that was really cool. Then, of course, there's the song A Different Corner, which was also on the Edge of Heaven album. And I remember that well, too, because when it came out is about the time that Wham was breaking up. And listening to the song lyrics, you could easily think, and I did at times, that it was about their breakup as a band. There were a lot of rumors at the time about why Wham was breaking up. Was George in love with Andrew, and Andrew wasn't gay? Was there a rift in their relationship? Because we didn't have the internet to either set things straight or spread rumors. We had teen magazines. And so they were printed, they were out for a month, and that's what you knew, or newspapers, but that was pretty much it. You didn't have the availability of social media for Andrew and George to quickly go there and say, hey, yo, that's not the deal. I think I did read once or twice a quote from them saying there really was no problem that caused the breakup, but I had a hard time believing that. And really, this book from Andrew Ridgeley sets it straight that there was not a rift that caused the breakup of Wham. The breakup was caused because the way they designed Wham as a group, it was a young band that attracted the attention of tween girls like me and tween and teen. And then also just the energy and the image that they had really was not something that they could carry on for a long time. And also, once George blossomed, even though Andrew told George they were starting a band, George had an innate talent for music. He was just very insecure. And Andrew, with his security, helped bring that out of George. And they knew that ultimately George wanted to go solo. That's where he could really open up and express himself and be free to flourish musically. So to set the record straight, according to Andrew Ridgeley and his book, Wham, George Michael and Me, there was nothing negative that caused the breakup. Something interesting that Andrew does write about in the book, though, is the transition from them creating the music together to George just doing it. Since George Michael passed, and I'll tell you, I was shocked when the news came through. It was actually somebody, my stepdaughter, called to let us know on Christmas evening when she heard about it. And she was the first one who told me. My husband had known, but he didn't tell me because we were having family dinner. But she called and told me because she knew that I liked George Michael's music. And I was just shocked. And still, there are times when I hear his music and I'm so sad that his voice has been silenced because his talent is just incredible. His voice can tell stories. And I really looked forward to more music from George Michael. So I'm sad that we don't get the benefit of more new music from him. Although the movie Last Christmas that is coming out in just a few weeks, I think, that movie was based on the song Last Christmas from Wham, and it is going to feature at least one brand new George Michael song, so something that he had recorded before he passed away. So that we've been promised at least one new George Michael song in that movie. But when it goes back to the writing for Wham, they wrote the songs, at least some of the songs, from their first album together. And that was the Fantastic album with Club Tropicana and Wham Rap. They also co-wrote Careless Whisper, which I had read that Andrew was a co-writer on that. Before having this book, I had read that he was a co-writer on it. And I actually always thought he was a co-writer on all of the music. Even though people would say, oh, he's the other guy in Wham, he doesn't do anything. He did. He played music. He sang background. He co-wrote some of the songs. And he co-wrote part of Careless Whisper. I think it was the musical part of it. And they actually included that small bit on their demo tape. But it wasn't until the Make It Big album that they recorded it. So Andrew Ridgeley writes that Careless Whisper was released in Great Britain as just a George Michael song because the folks over in Great Britain were very familiar with the group. But in the U.S., where we weren't as familiar, they decided to release it as Wham featuring George Michael. I'm glad that Andrew co-wrote it because there are so many TV shows and movies where I hear part of Careless Whisper, and of course it's a standard on the radio now, a staple for those adult contemporary radio stations. And so that means he still gets royalties. So I'm glad he's living comfortably. But what Andrew writes about in the book is how George blossomed. He really took control of the music. He wanted it perfect in his eyes. And Andrew saw that. So when it came to the Make It Big album, he basically relinquished the writing to George. Andrew said he was okay with it at the time, but there were a few moments here and there where it irked him that he wasn't co-writing with George anymore. And mainly it's because they didn't have the same bond together anymore because they weren't doing the joint music. They had a lot of fun together creating songs. And so Andrew sounded wistful about that, about having had those times together with George, and then with Make It Big, he didn't have it so much. And there's a moment in the book that Andrew writes about that happened with one of their early songs being released in Great Britain and why it didn't go as high on the charts as they thought it should have. And when George found out what it was, that's when he really took control of the music. Because he didn't say cheated, but he didn't want to get cheated again. He wanted to make sure they were as successful as he thought they could be. I'm not going to tell you the moment, though, because I want you to read about it in Wham, George Michael, and Me. Some of the other fun stories in Andrew Ridgeley's book include the people that they met, the people whose albums they had listened to, songs they sang together and danced to together, and then they end up meeting these people because those singers end up becoming fans of them, or their kids end up becoming fans of Wham. Well, one of the people is Elton John. Now, they loved Elton John. And apparently Elton John found out that they were in the south of France recording the Make It Big album, and he invited them to lunch. And George and Andrew were beside themselves. Hey, Elton John knew who they were? And he wanted to have lunch with them. And that was back when Elton John was drinking a lot. So they had quite a good time that lasted into the evening, according to the story that Andrew wrote. And it ended up near the water. Joan Collins was in Saint-Tropez. She was in the same area. And a drunk George yelled out over the water because she was reportedly on a yacht in the water there. He yelled out, "Joan, show us your knickers," which over there is underwear. Oh, that's another thing about the book, is you really get an insight into some language that is used by folks over in Great Britain that we're not used to using here, and even more so than I think you hear in interviews. It's kind of cool. I had to look some words up, but it was fun getting that perspective. Once again, this is Laura with the Voice of Laura Anderson podcast talking about Wham, George Michael, and Me, the new book by Andrew Ridgeley. It's a memoir, and he was my favorite as a teenager. I was in love with Andrew Ridgeley. I'm not anymore, but I still had to read the book, and I enjoyed it very much so. One funny story, another one about them meeting a celebrity, had to do with Jimmy Page. So Andrew played the guitar, and he idolized Jimmy Page. Well, when they were in concert one time, Jimmy Page came backstage to meet them, but it was because his daughter was a Wham fan. Andrew was a bit embarrassed by that, but still excited to meet Jimmy Page. And then another time, Stevie Nicks tried to get backstage to meet them in Philadelphia, and she got turned away. They managed to get her back, but she seemed a little miffed by what had happened. It wasn't them, it was security. If you know Wham, then you know the Freedom video. I'm talking about from the Make It Big album. It was filmed in China. They were the first Western pop act to perform in China. Back then, China was still communist and very much closed off to the world, and it was a huge deal that they went over there. I thought they were invited over because they were so popular, but it turns out a lot more went into that, and I found out about that from a George Michael special magazine. It's mentioned somewhat here, but in more detail in that magazine, how it came to be. Their manager, Simon Napier, thought it would be a good idea for them to go over to China because if they got over there and were able to perform there, the world would be paying attention as a news story, and that would help them become instantly popular in the U.S. It seemed to work. But what he did is for months, he would go over there every month, Simon would. He would go over there every month and spend several days wining and dining the officials that needed to sign off on this. And he worked them for months. So he spent a lot of money traveling there and also a lot of time in China to get this done. But he got it done. And it turns out around the same time, according to Simon, around the same time, one of Wham's idols, the group Queen and Freddie Mercury, also wanted to be the first to perform over in China. Well, when Simon got wind of it, he made a folder of Queen with photos of them in drag and Freddie Mercury's lifestyle and a bunch of things like that. And then he made a folder of Wham where they looked squeaky clean and just basic good guys. And he gave them both to the officials in China. And with their conservative nature back then, China went with Wham. That was a pretty good tactic. It worked. Back in the 80s, being gay was pretty much something you didn't talk about or announce about yourself. Elton John was able to still be successful despite announcing that he was homosexual, and Queen did very well also. But George Michael was worried that if he came out as gay, it would affect Wham's career and his future solo career. He actually didn't tell Andrew and Shirley, who was also part of the group and one of their friends, that he was gay until they were filming the Club Tropicana video in Ibiza. Now, they were his friends, so they were pretty much like, okay. But when it came to the rest of the world, George instinctively knew that his career would not go as far as he wanted it to if he announced at that time that he was gay. And all he had to do was look at Greg Louganis, who was my favorite diver. He was just amazing. And I saw some clippings of him from the 80s. And I got to see him dive in person. And at the 1988 Olympics is when he hit his head during a dive and ended up bleeding into the pool. Now, there had been rumors that he was gay, but nothing confirmed. He had to confirm it because he had HIV. So he had to say that because they had to clean out the pool. And even though he became the best diver of all time and an amazing Olympian, and he should have been on the Wheaties box and should have had endorsements, he didn't get them because he came out as gay. And that was really wrong, but that's how it was back in the 80s. Now, a few years ago, Wheaties came out. There were a few people who should have been on Wheaties boxes, but weren't for various reasons. Well, they made up for it, and they came out with a series of Wheaties boxes with previous champions, and he was one of them. So, yes, I bought the box. I mentioned a little earlier that Andrew had written about George's focus on success. One of the things that Andrew wrote in the book, and I'll quote him, and this was about George, he'd become obsessed with the numbers. It was his only real measure of success and so functioned as a barometer of how he was growing as a songwriter. By comparison, reviews and column inches meant little to him. In China, he only left his hotel room for shows or the next VIP meet and greet on the itinerary. And when he did, trailed by a gaggle of Western photographers and journalists, he took very little interest in the local culture, architecture, or landscape around us. The physical experience of traveling just didn't appeal to him. Music was so all-encompassing that he really rarely considered anything else. It bordered on pathological, and our radio plugger Gary Farrow was hounded by George for the latest midweek chart positions, radio plays, and sales numbers. Hits indicated that his songwriting was good. Number ones meant it was the best. As far as George was concerned, our Chinese adventure could only be considered worthwhile if it fueled global record sales. On the other hand, Andrew did get out. He did experience China, and he was very moved by what it was to live in China and how the country was run compared to his life back in Great Britain. And he wrote, "I returned home grateful for the liberties that allowed us the freedom to express ourselves. China had been like visiting the moon." Andrew writes about touring and that he very much enjoyed touring. He liked it for two reasons. One, he loved to play live. And the other is that it gave him and George time together that was kind of like old times when they were teens. The sense you get from this book is how dear their friendship was to Andrew. Andrew Ridgeley also writes about the final concert called The Final. It was when Wham announced that they were going to break up, and he really wanted to do a tour, a final tour for the fans as a way to say thank you and to get to play together again and to play live. But he said that George didn't want to do that. He just wanted to do what they called a one-off, one concert, one big concert. That was it. And I remember the concert at Wembley Stadium. I really, really wanted tickets. I wanted to be able to go so badly. There was no way in heck I was going to be able to, but I really wanted to be able to go. I mean, you could see videos of it, but it's just not the same. But they had that final tour. They had some special guest stars, including Elton John, who sang with George Michael. And there, at the end, George Michael hugged Andrew, and he whispered something into Andrew's ear. You'll find out what he whispered into Andrew's ear in the book. It's really important, though, and I think it's true. About the final concert, though, versus a tour, Andrew writes, I fully understood his decision and accepted it. In fact, the only thing that did annoy me during that period was the cancellation of a contract we had signed with Pepsi worth over $3 million. Andrew writes that he was angry when George pulled the plug on that because the money would have helped them recoup some of the costs of the final concert, which apparently was quite expensive to produce. In the book, you find out about how George Michael went from his long, hard-to-pronounce Greek name to George Michael and what it did for him. It became a persona for him. And Andrew writes about how that affected George in a positive way, mostly, when it came to his music. And then he also writes, my own dad had preempted any possible need for a similar move on my part when he swapped Albert Zachariah for Albert Ridgeley. Love that. I forgot to mention one more story in there that I love, and it explains something I wondered for such a long time. When the Band-Aid album came out, and it came out the same time as Last Christmas, which really irked George Michael because he knew that song would go to number 1. But because of Band-Aid, it didn't. It went to number 2. Well, anyway, I wondered why Andrew Ridgeley wasn't part of Band-Aid. George Michael was there. Why wasn't Andrew Ridgeley? It turns out that he also got an invitation to be there, but the invitation one was very nondescript because it was a secretive thing that was going on. So he just thought it was just another invitation and he had better things to do, so he didn't go. And then when he later found out what it was, he regretted it. It would have been nice to have that video with him in it too. But at least we have a book now. As I went on through the 90s and was able to get into commercial radio after college, my first full-time radio job was at a radio station in Brunswick, Georgia. It was basically a top 40 station, and I did the midday show, including the Burger King 70s and 80s at noon, which was great because I got to play Wham. But I remember one time my program director and I getting into a bit of an argument. I don't remember how it came up that it appeared to be a conflict with him. It had to do with Freedom, the song from the Make It Big album, and George Michael's Freedom 90. He insisted they were the same song. I knew my Wham. I said, they are not the same song. I said, let me play it for you. He's like, no, they're the same song. We don't need to play both. They're not the same song. Finally, I got him to listen and realize they're not the same song. During that time also, though, is when George Michael went to the bathroom in California and got caught. And in later interviews, and you know what he got caught for. In later interviews, he said that he thinks subconsciously he did that to out himself as gay because it was so hard keeping that in. And I guess he didn't know how to tell the world he was gay. But if you get caught trying to pander for gay sex in a bathroom in a park in L.A., then word gets out. So there was that debacle. And at that time, I wanted to do a bit about it on the radio. Back in the 70s, there was a song that came out. It was at the height of Jaws Mania. And it was by a man named Dickie Goodman called Mr. Jaws. And it was a record interview spoof. So he would say that he's talking with Jaws and other people on the beach and ask questions, but it wouldn't be people answering. It would be short song clips, popular songs, like Your Smiling Face or a song from the Eagles. Well, I saw this as an opportunity to play a lot of Wham songs for the world, or at least short clips of a lot of Wham songs for the world. So I put together a bit, and I actually hadn't heard it in about 20 years until I recently found a CD that had it on there. I had transferred it from reel to reel to a CD. So the quality is a little iffy, but this is how it went.
What were you doing in that Beverly Hills bathroom? Oh, it's not a bore. Mr. Michael! Mr. Michael, what did you say when the officer found you in this lewd public act? And so you were arrested. What was it like being a celebrity in jail? Really? And so how did you stay busy? Mr. Michael, your fans seem to be having a hard time with your arrest.
So you don't approve, but we'll have to do.
They're just trying to deal with such a shocking story of an idol.
Call me good, call me bad, call me anything you want to, baby.
I think we're all wondering why a wealthy, famous person such as yourself, Mr. Michael, would do what you did in a public bathroom, even if it is in Beverly Hills.
There's little things you hide, and little things that you show.
Mr. Michael, we're almost out of time, and I do thank you for joining us today. How do you plan to make this up to your fans?
Time can never mend.
So this is the last time that we'll hear your name in the news for such an incident?
Just this once, twice, forever.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Michael. I do look forward to hearing some new music from you.
Hey, everybody, take a look at me. I've got street credibility.
With that incident, George Michael ran with it and turned it into a song and a fun video that the police got mad at. But I love the way he turned it into a positive musically. I'd like to thank you so much for listening to the Voice of Laura Anderson podcast and specifically listening to me talk about Wham and Andrew Ridgeley. I do recommend his book, especially if you are a Wham fan or a George Michael fan. You can get some great information from Andrew Ridgeley in his memoir, Wham, George Michael, and Me. It's published by Penguin Random House UK, which is a part of the Random House Group Limited, and I'd like to thank very much Ellie Hughes with Random House for sending the book to me to read. And thank you, Andrew Ridgeley, for sharing your stories with us. Have a whamtastic day.